Um, so today is sort of our wrap up and question and answer. I don't have any interesting. I don't have any slides for today because this question and answer. If we have anything, I can bring up my from the previous ones. If there was a particular question from a previous slide that we did, but sort of a recap through. We looked at back in the very first lesson. We talked about the Bible, and I think probably the overarching lesson, the overarching objective that I would get out of the class across the board is that the Bible is not a science textbook, but that doesn't mean that the things that are in the Bible go against science. That was the thing that was the main part of lesson one, looking at different aspects where in sort of many times in a little bit poetic phrasing, poetic language, there are things that are stated in the Bible, but that those things, when you apply them to a scientific standpoint, it turns out they're absolutely true in various aspects, whether it was physics, whether it was meteorology, whether it was physiology of our bodies, how our bodies work, things like that. That was the main thing, and that there are so many, as we saw in a couple of the videos as well, that it seems like mainstream science is the secular, non-biblical mindset. That seems to be changing somewhat, and we're getting more and more scientists, modern scientists, that go back to what many of our early scientists were. I mean, one of the greatest minds ever to walk the planet, Isaac Newton, was a very religious man, very strong in his convictions, to the point where when he was appointed or was offered the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge University, to be a professor at one of the English universities, you also basically have to be ordained into the Anglican Church. And he said no, he didn't want to do that and was going to turn down the chairmanship. And they made an exception for him specifically. And not because he wasn't religious, but because he didn't want to be tied to the specific dogma of the Anglican Church. But very, very religious man. Many of our early scientists believed that if they could understand more about science, they were understanding more about the creation, which was the fingerprint of God. And then we looked at the whole concept of evolution, and we saw those couple of videos on evolution, seeing that that is as much of a religion, as much as a belief, as our belief is, because their amount of facts are very, very small. They've got to believe that based on some magic invisible process. Wow, it's amazing how they will say, oh, will you believe in this magic invisible process called God that created the universe? And yet they believe in this magic invisible process called evolution. It's kind of interesting that they have that mindset. You heard about the scientists that finally believed that they were able to reproduce creation and be able to basically disprove God. So they contacted God and had God come down to the laboratory and said, yeah, we can do this. We can do what you can do. And the scientist said to God, you can go first. So God goes and he grabs stuff and he makes a living creature. Great. And the scientist said, all right, now it's our turn. And they go out to get a shovel full of dirt, and God says, oh, no. You make your own dirt. They've got this mindset that they can explain how the universe works, but they don't have the mindset of where did it come from? Where did it start? Where did all this stuff come from? And then we also looked at the origin of the universe, the Big Bang Theory, and the idea of intelligent design, how much our universe seems to be so finely tuned to life. And again, their argument, and there is a theory, or I would say a hypothesis, because there really is no evidence for it, a hypothesis called the many worlds hypothesis. It's the idea that there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of universes out there, that ours isn't the only one. There's a lot of variations on it. The main variation is that literally every decision that we make causes sort of a split in the universe, and it creates another universe in which I wore my gray suit this morning instead of wearing my blue suit. And how does that change it? That seems like a really tiny thing, but their mindset is that that creates another universe. And if there's this literally infinite number of universes, it shouldn't surprise us that we exist, because we exist, in the one universe that seems to be fine-tuned to our existence. And the reason why it's fine-tuned to our existence is because we're here. Anybody catch the circle there? I mean, it's an interesting argument that, yeah, we're here to question the fact that the universe seems to be fine-tuned because the universe is fine-tuned and because we're here. If you go by that many worlds hypothesis, sure, okay. But again, it's ultimately, it still ultimately goes back to, but where did the universe come from in the first place? We've sort of already gotten rid of the very early mindset of the universe has always existed. That was one of the early mindsets. The universe has always existed, will always exist. Again, it's interesting how scientific discoveries sort of point in the right direction. They just sort of take the wrong exit as they're doing that. That the Big Bang Theory opens the door. That's what was so interesting. The Big Bang Theory opened the door for an origin point to the universe. Prior to the Big Bang Theory, it was this, what they called the steady state theory, the fact the universe existed and has always existed. They opened the door to the mindset that there can be a start point. Ooh, well, if there's a start point, what's producing, or where's that start point coming from? That opens the door to a creation point, an origin point. They'll never accept that mindset, but yeah, it did. So it is interesting how it does lead into those different areas. So sort of an overview of what we've looked at. Again, it ultimately though comes back to the Bible, that we are looking at biblical creation created by an omnipotent God who created the universe good. In fact, he says it was very good. And sin came into that world and has basically caused all of the other things that we see now in terms of how the universe works. The fact that the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, disorder is always increasing. The second law of thermodynamics is sin. It literally is sin when you think about it. The first law, energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. We can change energy from one form to another. Great, cool, fantastic. That's God's very good universe that doesn't wear out, that doesn't fall apart. And yet, when sin comes into the world, now that sort of introduces the second law, that every time you convert energy from one form to another, you lose some. Disorder is constantly increasing. The world is wearing out, which was not the case prior to sin coming into the world. And it's amazing how it lines up. So all that being said, I'm going to open it up to you guys. Instead of me up here yapping, I'm going to open it up to you guys. Was there anything else, any questions, anything you wanted me to clarify, anything you wanted me to touch on. Like I said, I can sort of go back um, into my slides and, oops, do it this way. Open with PowerPoint. There we go. Look at that stuff. And no, go. And sort of go back to anything particular you need to want some clarification on. Chuck, and
One thing that's always fascinated me is the intricacy of design. I was, being in the landscape tree business, just to investigate that, how that actually operates and everything. But then even more complex than that is the human body and how everything is put together. So it just boggles my mind that anybody could think that just something like that happened. It just,
yeah, just the.
place for me to believe the other.
I agree. Just the amazing detail of design. And what's so funny is, and it was in one of the videos, the thing where they showed that microscopic image of that little mite, this incredibly complex thing that is microscopically tiny, and yet is supposed to be a, air quotes, primitive organism. And yet you look at the complexity, even in that organism. That's one of the things in evolution that they don't really explain is, okay, fine, let's go with primitive single cell organisms that gradually get more and more and more and more complex until they get to us. Cool. Two explanations they don't they never can get around is that intricacy, that detail, even in a primitive single cell organism. The organelles, the structures that are within the cell that make the cell function are incredibly, incredibly complex. They happen to be really, really tiny, but they're still incredibly complex. What we don't see is what we see is a change from a Model T to a modern Ford F-150. Okay? The basic concept behind the internal combustion engine is still the same. The wheels are still the same. The steering is still the same. All that kind of stuff is still the same. It's gotten to have a lot more things on it, and the design is different, and it looks different, and it can go faster, and it can do other things. But essentially, a Model T and an F-150, 100 years apart, are for all intents and purposes identical. The detail work of why does an internal combustion engine work? How does a steering box work? How does a starter work? Is sort of like the same thing. The cells that are in a microscopic organism and the cells that are in us are just as complex. They're exactly as complex. That single cell organism is the Model T, we're the F-150, but the basic functionality, that intricate functionality is still the same. And where did that come from? What we don't see is that progression from a stick figure drawing to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in living things. There's no difference. Like I said, there's no difference between the cells of an amoeba and the cells of us in the functions that are inside those cells and the structures that are inside those cells. But an amoeba is supposed to be an early primitive organism, and we're supposed to be this later, more advanced organism. And yet, if you take a microscope and look at those cells, they're no different. They work the same way. Where's the simpler cells that have simpler internal structures, like my stick figure drawing? compared to the end point of evolution. And we're the end point of evolution? I sometimes wonder about that. Um, that what we see now is like the perfection point. The other thing that we don't see, again, that irreducible complexity, that mindset that things are, even in those really primitive organisms, so complex, but they're supposed to be so early in the process. The other thing they never explain is why everything doesn't evolve. If you were to look at a photograph of a great white shark, and you were to, and again, going with paleontologists and going with secular scientists, if you look at an organism called Carcharodon megalodon, megalodon was supposedly a well, not supposedly, it existed. It was a prehistoric shark, looks just like a great white. The big difference is if you took Carcharodon megalodon's mouth, and you've probably seen these if you've gone to almost any aquarium, if you put the mouth, the jaws of megalodon, it would be bigger than those doors. You could literally walk through that mouth and not touch the top of it. That's megalodon. You're looking at a great white shark that is 75 to 100 feet long, compared to Jaws from the movie. I know it was fake, but great white shark, 15, 20 feet long. And yet, other than size scale, they're identical. Great white shark is modern. Megalodon is supposedly 200 million years old. Why didn't they change other than get smaller? In one of the videos, they showed a dragonfly, a fossilized dragonfly compared to a modern dragonfly. They look exactly the same. What's interesting is so many of those organisms back then were a lot bigger. Oh, that's because the earth was better then, and things could grow to a larger size because the conditions were better, and things can't grow to as large a size today because things are deteriorating and the genetic information is deteriorating. And they can't explain that. It's the funny part is they can't explain those two pieces, how insanely detailed biology is, even at supposedly very early organisms, and why don't some things change? John, go ahead.
So are you saying that this shark that we've seen in the prehistoric museums, that was an anomaly, like Goliath? Or are you saying that
No, it was probably just an organism that existed. It just was bigger. Just like we have fossil evidence of horses that would make Clydesdales look like ponies from the past, pre-flood. Not necessarily like giants like Goliath and the Nephilim. Just that organisms were bigger back then. God made things bigger back then.
because wouldn't that follow with natural selection that there would be no smaller fish because the big one ate them all because he's the biggest guy on the block?
But the smaller fish can also avoid and can hide better. So there is that diversity of size. We still see that today. Yeah, there you go. John and Ron, a little short Ron there. But it's true. You got to realize, my mom was 5 foot tall. So short jokes to me are they're one of those automatic things. But that's variation, not so much natural selection and evolution, yeah. But those, how is it that some of these organisms, there were amoebas, again, with their mindset, there were amoebas way back then, we still have amoebas now. Why? Why didn't they all change? No explanation for that one. And if you ask that question, they just kind of go, and they'll give you something, but nothing that's a legitimate answer to why. because they don't have one. Why do some things evolve but others don't? Oh, and again, let's argue that evolution is legit. Let's take that argument. And as we saw, in order for evolution to happen, in order for things to go from less complex to more complex, in order to things go from less ordered to more ordered, that can happen if there's an outside guiding influence. If scientists could absolutely, irrefutably prove that evolution occurs, they've just proved the existence of a supreme being. If they could prove it, if they could prove evolution was happening. Because the only way that evolution can happen, the only way in our universe that things can go from less ordered to more ordered is if there's an outside guiding influence. And what is there that is an outside guiding influence outside of our universe other than some kind of transcendent being that is outside and above our universe? Again, that in my mind is defining God. And I kind of get a chuckle out of that one. And if you use that argument too, then they get all they get all offended about that. But it's truth. It's the reality of it. I get a chuckle out of that. I like tweaking evolutionists' brains and watching their heads explode, or watch them. They give me a face looking like their brains rebooting. Yes, dear.
I just wanted to say that sometimes I think we can feel intimidated and afraid to speak to other people about such things because there's so many details. Like you see that he has a lot of information, right? And we can't hold all this information and then give it back to people in the right way because it's overwhelming. It's so much information. So for me, I feel like the most important thing is to take all this in and then just, like in the way that he's trying to say, the overarching thing I want you to get from that lesson is this, sort of like the bullet points, the main objective that you need to remember from this, that, and the other. Just hold on to that truth because it's really about the truth, right? And as a Christian, when we want to, um, tell people the truth, it's not always having all the details that matters. It's about having the power of God, right? And when we have the Holy Spirit in us, which we do when we're saved, we have the Holy Spirit in us, and we just need to rely on Him and ask God to take this information that He has given to us now. We now have that, and help us, Lord, in every situation where we need that information, that we can hold on to the main truth of it, so that when we talk to somebody about it, we'll remember whatever that little nugget of truth is that we need to share with that person. It may not be some, deep scientific detail. It might just be some overarching truth that we've learned, that we've picked up from this study, that might be the one thing that ministers to that person, that plants a seed in their mind of doubt about the thing that they've always believed. So really, I guess my point is just take what we've heard here and then trust God to use whatever He's given to us, because He's the one that's going to use whatever He's given us to help us to be useful to Him. So don't be afraid.
That's that's perfect. I'll take you shopping tonight. But that's the thing. I mean, I have a lot of science expertise, truth, but you don't need that to be able to. Scientific dialogue, scientific discourse is exactly that. It's a back and forth, and it's sad to see how science, and I think it started with this, how science has turned so much more into a very dogmatic, a very, this is the way it is because I say this is the way it is kind of mindset, to the point where conflicting ideas get shut down. Now, that's not necessarily new. Galileo discovered these moons going around the planet Jupiter, and at the time, there was the big debate between the Earth being the center of the solar system and the sun being the center of the solar system. And a Polish scientist, Copernicus, came up with a sun-centered system. And there was a lot of debate going on about that. Galileo is one of those whose works helped to support the sun-centered system, because his question was, okay, guys, if the Earth is at the center of the universe and everything goes around the Earth, what are these things that are going around Jupiter? But also keep in mind, Galileo, and that was his last name, his first name, by the way. He's sort of like Cher. He just goes by the one name. His name was Galileo Galilei. All right, Galileo was his first name. And the big problem with Galileo was that he was in Italy in the 1600s. And what's going on in Italy in the 15 and 1600s? Even today, the Catholic Church. And basically the Pope said, you'd better take that back. And he said, no. And they put him under house arrest for a very large proportion of his life. They didn't dare execute him. That was, Galileo's discoveries were post-Protestant Reformation. So the Catholic Church's power was starting to wane a little bit historically, to the point where Galileo's family was a very, very wealthy, powerful, important family in Italy, to the point where the Pope couldn't afford to execute him, which they normally would do for something like that, for heresy, because they couldn't he couldn't afford to alienate that powerful family. So they just threw him in house arrest. And again, go by their doctrine, the Pope is infallible. By Catholic doctrine, the Pope is infallible. The Pope finally admitted that he was, well, no, they didn't admit he was wrong. He came out with a papal statement that basically removed the excommunication and house arrest of Galileo. And their statement was that it was made on the conviction of him and what was happening to him by the church was done because of incomplete information. And now that we have more information and more scientific information, it turned out that Galileo was right. And it wasn't that the Pope back then was wrong. Can't say that. He just made that determination based on insufficient information. That happened in the mid-'80s. Galileo was finally admitted by the Catholic Church to be correct. So that mindset, that sort of dogmatic, anti-scientific discourse mindset has occurred in the past, but we see it so much today. I mean, we don't need to go political with it, but it's truth. During the whole COVID foolishness, you're going to wear masks because that's going to protect you. The holes in the masks are bigger than the virus particles. So the virus particles can go through the holes in the masks. So the masks are going to protect you. How? But if you said that, you got bopped on the head. You're not being scientific. Yes, I am. I'm asking a legitimate scientific question. But you were shot down on that. If you came up with a treatment that was working, that you had evidence that it actually worked, you got smacked down for it. All right? And it's scientific discourse has gotten so much to that mindset, but I think it's changing. I think it definitely is changing. We're seeing more questioning of certain the aspects, but they question it in a weird way. Oh, the Webb telescope has discovered this thing about the early part of the universe that scientists can't explain. And it seems to go against the Big Bang Theory as they continue to study it. So they sort of lay that in there as if, oh, well, eventually they'll figure out how this stuff that they found will fit in with the Big Bang Theory, and it'll be fine. It's the Big Bang Theory is still right, even though we found some things that don't match up with it. It's okay. We'll figure it out. That's what happened with the Earth-centered system. We had the Earth-centered system. There was a lot of evidence to support it. And yet they kept, well, but what about this? Oh, we can explain that this way. Well, what about this? We can explain that this way. And they tried to build these new discoveries into the Earth-centered system, but eventually it got to the point where it fell apart. And Newton's law of gravitation is what really knocked it apart. The big one should be in the center because the big one's the one with all the gravity. So the sun is at the center, not the Earth. But it took that sort of straw that broke the camel's back to really completely disprove the Earth-centered system and prove the sun-centered system. I see the same thing happening with the Big Bang Theory today. That they keep finding these new things and they keep trying to tack them in and try to force it into it. And they keep doing it, but eventually I think eventually it's going to collapse. That theory, that hypothesis is going to collapse. I'll call it a theory. There's pieces of evidence to support it. I'll call it a theory, as opposed to evolution that is not a theory. Evolution is a hypothesis, straight up. Any other questions, other things you want me to touch on? There's so much stuff. Okay.
I think you already kind of told it to say how long it takes for the evolution cycle, one thing to turn into something else.
They don't, because they don't see it. What you see is the old organism, you see the new organism, and the old organism, again, with their mindset, the old organism was existing here, the new organism was existing here, but they don't have anything to show that transition. And it goes back to all of the dating methods and things like that are flawed. And especially when you get the things where in the fossil layers, you've got the earlier organism should be toward the bottom, and the more recent organisms should be closer to the top. But there are geological layers where they're flipped around, where the earlier things are above the low. Oh, but there was a geological process that made those layers flip upside down. Okay. And a lot of that sort of ties in. We have an explanation for that. We have a really good explanation for that. It's called the flood. All right, that can cause that kind of thing to happen. That can cause, again, one of their so-called earlier, more primitive organisms to be in a layer above the more modern organisms. That can cause these layers to get bent and twisted the way that that we see, and we see them. We see these insanely bent and twisted. Let me see if I can find this real quick. Let's see. Sort of a advertisement for our next lessons coming up. Now, if you take a rock or anything else that is a really hard material, glass, right? You take a sheet of glass and you bend a sheet of glass and bend it and bend it and bend it. What's it do? It breaks. It shatters. Okay? Well, there we go. Let's see if I can make this go over there. Yes, I can. With my fat finger. There you go. And there you are. mouse there. So how do you make rocks look like that? Or like that? Or like that? Or like that? Those are sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks are rocks that are laid down as layers and layers and layers and layers of material that sinks down through the water and makes layers and layers and layers and layers. Great, cool. But and their argument is, oh, well, if the rock gets heated, it gets soft, and now it can bend. Sure, true, absolutely it can. But as soon as you do that, what happens to the layers? They get mushed together. The layers get messed up. This is rock that is just, the geological term is folded. It's a folded rock formation. How do you get a folded rock formation like that? See the truck in front of it? That's like an SUV, like a Ford Explorer kind of thing. All right? These insanely, and I love the caption for that photo. Intricate layers of folded rock reveal a history of tectonic forces at work. But if you bend that, it doesn't bend, it breaks. It's called an earthquake. That's what happens. How do you get that? Well, again, the flood explains it, but that they don't have. They present that, but the sort of explanation of it, of how it gets looking like that. I mean, here we go. Where is my mouse? Oh, there you are. It goes from one screen to the other, and I lose it. I mean, this is their diagram of it folding and then erosion on the surface and stuff like that. Yeah, that's all great and wonderful, but how are you folding those rocks like that? How are you making those rocks bend and fold? I lost my mouse again. There you are. I mean, that one's literally like completely folded around and flipped around. There's no good explanation for it, and they don't have a good explanation for how do you get to that? How do you get from one organism to the other? They don't have that. They don't have the steps in between, and if you don't have the steps in between, they don't have a timeline. There's where it comes down to, is that you don't have a timeline for it. If you don't have the intermediary steps, you don't have a timeline. It just is. They've got those individual pieces. I thought it was interesting that in the one video, the two things that I really, well, there were three big things that I really got out of that I liked. One was showing the evolutionary, what they call the tree of life, that starts from the one and sort of branches out. That's the evolution mindset. But then the creation mindset of the individual kinds and how those kinds split out and change, variation within a kind, all different kinds of dogs, all different kinds of cats, all different kinds of people, but they're all still the same organisms. And I don't know if you noticed in that video how some of those branches split off and stop. Organisms do go extinct. That does happen. That distinction there between the tree of life and he referred to it as the forest of life, which I thought was really kind of cool. But that, and then the mindset of how evolution tries to explain how things change, but it never explains the origin, where it starts from. They can try to explain how things change from one kind of organism to the other, but it never addresses where did it come from in the first place? They had done some experiments back in the 50s where they put all kinds of chemicals into a chemical soup, which is supposed to be like what the early ocean was like, and then zapped it with electricity, which is like lightning hitting something. The last time I checked, lightning hits things and it breaks things up, doesn't make things form. Again, it's just me. But and supposedly it formed primitive amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. Okay, great. What's really interesting is scientists have tried to reproduce that experiment since the 50s. And do you know what they've gotten out of it? Electrified soup. They've never been able to reproduce the result of putting these chemicals together, zapping them with electricity, and getting primitive amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. Supposedly the building blocks of life is what they talk about. They've never been able to reproduce those experiments. Part of the scientific method is observation, experimentation, and a third piece, repeatability. You need to be able to reproduce those experimental results. If you can't reproduce the experimental result, you know what you call that? Oops. It was a mistake. It's not legit. It was an oops. All right? One experimental result does not prove anything. You need to be able to reproduce it, and they've never been able to reproduce it. Which I find interesting that he really emphasized the fact that they never are able to address that origin point. Where did it come from? Where did it start? But again, as Denise said, you don't need to be an evolutionary biologist to be able to disprove evolution. It's that common sense thing. That's really what it comes down to. You don't need to be a physicist. You don't need to be a biologist. You need to be a thinking person. And you need to just, you make those logical common sense arguments and let them try to explain it. You don't have to explain it. Let them try to explain it. They can't. Good, John.
Someone asking also, do they believe that things are still evolving today? And what's their so-called evidence?
Yeah, they do. But keep in mind, and we'll wrap with this, they do believe that evolution is still happening today. Yes. But remember, evolution is a long, slow process. So, and I always used to give this one to my students. If I don't have one, if I had a rock, and I put a rock here on the table, that rock is alive. I submit to you that rock is alive. How long do rocks exist? Again, let's use their mindset, billions of years. So the lifespan of a rock is 1 billion years. Our 75 years on Earth to that rock. That rock is breathing, it's moving, it's doing all the things living things do. So slowly, we can't see it. Disprove it. You can't. Well, their mindset's the same thing, is that evolution is this insanely long, slow process, and we've been around for such a short amount of time, we don't see it actually happening. And all of the pieces of evidence that they say that are pieces of evidence to show evolution is not evolution, it's variation. All right? They have never, ever, never, try to say it again, never shown one species becoming another species. Okay? Doesn't happen. I loved it in that video where they showed all of the different hybrid organisms of a particular kind. zebras, donkeys, mules, horses, all those things, okay? And all the different insane variations, well, the liger, all right, the lion-tiger hybrid, and things like that. But he said, you've never seen a cat-dog hybrid because they're different kinds. Dogs and cats cannot breed together and make a hybrid. A lion and a tiger can because they're both cats. A wolf and a dog can because they're both cats. All of the things that they say that are examples of evolution, Darwin's finches, all these huge variety of finches in the Galapagos Islands that have adapted to their particular environment, great. But the thing that, I mean, the thing you throw back at them is, yeah, but they're all finches. Where have you seen a finch? Where have you seen a finch turn into an eagle? Let alone a finch turn into a dinosaur, or a dinosaur turn into a finch, which is their argument, all right, that dinosaurs became birds. It's amazing. They don't have that. Their excuse is it happens so slowly, and yet they try to show those examples, the finches, the two moths, the black and white speckled moths, things like that. They try to show those as evidence of evolution, but every single one of those are evidence of variation, not evolution. You're not changing kind. And that's the thing that they never find. You don't see, you show that, you see that picture of the lizard eventually evolving into man, that little sequence thing, all right? But we don't see that lizard or that fish gradually growing feet, a fish with little stubby feet, and now another species of fish with a little bit bigger sort of stubby feet, and then a fish with almost feet, and then a fish with feet. Oh, it's not a fish anymore, now it's a reptile. They don't say that. We don't see that. We see the fish at one end, we see the reptile at the other end, and they say there's a progression in between, going from fish to reptile. Nope. They don't have that. They don't have any of those. That was the other one where they showed the diagram with all of the connected branching things, and then the guy showed that same video without the connecting dotted lines, because they don't have those dotted lines that connect one species to another species don't exist. They don't have any of that evidence. It doesn't exist. So therefore, where's the evolution happening? We just see kinds. We don't see changing. God's in control. God's the one that's doing it. Not us, not nature, not long, slow process by chance. So, teaser. Genesis 6 to 8. The flood. The most chronologically detailed year in the entire Bible. Most chronologically detailed. On this particular day, on this particular year, in this particular month, on this particular day, this happened. And the same thing for the rest of the year. That after this number of days, this happened. After this number of days, this happened. After this number of days, this happened. And on this year, on this month, on this day, this happened. The flood. The most chronologically detailed year in the entire Bible. That's what we're going to start on next week. We're going to look at the Bible. What's the Bible say about the flood? We're then eventually going to go into this, all right? Where is the evidence that the flood actually happened? And then eventually, way down the line, we're going to go back to a really interesting set of verses that most people read over, and when they read over them, they go, as my father-in-law would say, This is the real teaser, and we'll wrap. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Because starting with Genesis 6, verse 5, God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were on evil continually. That's the start of God saying, I'm going to wipe out the world with a flood. But what about Genesis 6, 1 through 4? And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took to them wives of all of whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit will not always strive with man, for that he is also his flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were men of old, men of renown. What does that have to do with the flood? Everything. Everything. Those 4 verses have everything to do with the flood. And what does that have to do with today? The giants, in Hebrew, Nephilim. Wait till October comes around, Halloween, and look at the decorations you see out on people's yards. Those giant skeletons and giant demons and these giant decorations, 15, 20 foot tall. Where's that coming about all of a sudden? Where'd that come from? That's way down the line. We got to set it up first. All right? There you go. All right, let's close out. Lord, we thank you so much for this day. I thank you for the opportunity to be able to share from your word and to share from your creation. The things that show us that you exist, your fingerprints all over the creation, Lord, that show your existence. We thank you for this opportunity to come together. Thank you for this class. Pray that you would continue to be with us. Be with the service coming up. Be with Pastor. Hide him behind the cross. Have the message come out clear and strong. And we look forward to the baptisms that are to come at the end of the service today. All these things we ask and pray in your Son's name. Amen.